The night Mason Creed found her, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the desert wasn't apologizing for it. He'd killed the engine behind the Dusty Mile diner, shuttered 3 years, windows dark, parking lot cracked and forgotten, just to take a breath and let the cold clear his head. That's when he heard it. Not crying. Something worse than crying. A sound so small and exhausted it barely qualified as sound at all, like an animal that had already accepted the outcome. She was wedged between 2 stacks of empty wooden crates, knees pulled to her chest, a filthy stuffed rabbit pressed against her face. 6 years old, maybe less. Cheeks wind-burned raw, boots 2 sizes too big, the kind donated by strangers. When his shadow fell over her, she flinched so hard she knocked the crate sideways. But she didn't run. She had nothing left to run on. Her eyes found his, a massive man in a scarred leather cut, iron hollow riders arched across the back and cracked embroidery. And something passed through her face that wasn't hope yet. It was something smaller, the last possible version of trust a child could produce before it disappeared forever. "Please," she whispered, "please don't leave me." Mason Creed, a man who had survived 2 wars and buried 4 brothers, went down on one knee in the frozen gravel and didn't say a word. He unzipped his jacket, the one with 60,000 miles of American highway sewn into its lining, and wrapped it around her like it was the only thing he had to offer. It was. If this story moves something in you, stay. Subscribe to this channel, because the stories we tell here aren't about heroes and capes. They're about the ones nobody sees coming. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far Emma's story has traveled, because some stories deserve to go everywhere. The Dusty Mile had been closed long enough that the sign out front had stopped pretending. 3 letters hung at angles, the rest stripped by wind or teenagers or time, and the parking lot was nothing but cracked asphalt and the kind of silence that settles over a place after the last human warmth has finally left it. Mason Creed had stopped there because his rear tire had been pulling slightly left for 30 miles, and he didn't trust it in the dark on Route 9. That was the whole reason. A mechanical decision. The kind of logical, joyless calculation that had governed most of his life since he came back from the second deployment and found that the version of himself he'd sent overseas had not made the return trip. He was 51 years old. He had a face that looked like it had been used for something other than its original purpose. A jaw like poured concrete, a nose broken twice, once in Kandahar, once in a parking lot outside Tucson that he tried not to remember, and eyes the color of the desert in the hour before sunrise, that particular gray that isn't quite anything yet. He wore a black thermal under his cut, work boots that had resoled twice, and riding gloves with the fingers cut off even in the cold because he hated anything that dulled the feeling of the handlebars. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned most of the last decade. The sound reached him when he crouched to look at the tire. He straightened, stood still. The desert does strange things acoustically. Sounds travel distances that shouldn't be possible, flatten and multiply against rock formations and empty highway. So at first he thought it was a coyote pup, or wind through broken glass, or his own damaged hearing playing its usual games. Then it came again. He walked around the back of the diner without thinking about it, the way his body had learned in the military to move towards sounds before his brain could argue against it. The crates were stacked against the rear wall beside a rusted service door, 4 stacks of wooden pallets going up to maybe shoulder height on him, and she was curled in the narrow space between the second and third stack, so compressed into herself that he almost missed her. The rabbit was what registered first, a small stuffed animal, once white, now the color of the ground, held with both arms against her face in a grip that suggested she'd been holding it for a very long time and had no intention of releasing it under any circumstances. Mason stood at the edge of the crate stack for a moment without moving. She heard him. He watched her whole body seize with the knowledge of another presence, watched her make herself smaller in the way children do when they've learned that becoming smaller sometimes helps, and the sight of it hit him in a place beneath his sternum that he typically kept sealed. "Hey," he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. "I'm not going to touch you. I'm just standing here." She didn't answer. He could hear her breathing, so fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that comes after hours of crying and fear and cold. "My name is Mason," he said. He lowered himself to a crouch so he wasn't looming. "I ride motorcycles. I'm nobody to be scared of. A pause that lasted long enough for the wind to pick up and send a sheet of grit across the parking lot. Then very slowly, the stuffed rabbit lowered a few inches, and a pair of eyes appeared above it, dark brown, red-rimmed from crying or cold or both. Taking inventory of him with the particular seriousness of a child who has recently learned that the world does not automatically mean her well. "You have a big jacket," she said. "Yeah." "Are you cold?" It was such an unexpectedly specific question, not "who are you" or "what do you want" or the silence of pure terror, that it stopped him for a second. "Little bit," he said. "You?" She didn't answer that directly, just looked at him for another long moment, then, "Please don't leave me." Her voice dropped to almost nothing on the last word. Not a demand, not even really a request, more like a statement of what she couldn't survive. Mason Creed, who had not cried at his own father's funeral, who had held men together with his bare hands while they died in the sand, who had spent a decade cultivating the particular emotional distance that kept him functional, felt something crack loose somewhere in the architecture of his chest. He unzipped his cut, shrugged it off his shoulders. The cold hit him immediately, and he registered it the way he registered most discomfort now, which was to say, he noticed it and moved past it. He leaned forward slowly, announced every movement. "I'm going to put this around you, okay? That's all." She watched him do it. Didn't flinch this time. When the leather settled around her shoulders, heavy and warm from his body heat, she gripped the lapels in both small fists and pulled it tighter, and the stuffed rabbit got folded into the middle of it like something being protected inside something larger. She was 6, maybe 7, light enough that when he finally, very gently, lifted her, telegraphing every movement, giving her every opportunity to refuse, she barely registered his weight. Her head found the space below his collarbone, and she pressed into it with the instinct of an exhausted child finding the safest available position. And Mason stood up with her in his arms and stood there in the freezing dark behind the Dusty Mile diner and felt the strangeness of the moment settle over him like the cold air. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know where she'd come from. He didn't know what had put her here, alone, in 11-degree darkness, with boots that didn't fit and a rabbit she was willing to die protecting. What he knew was that he wasn't leaving her here. He carried her around to the front where his bike sat, its chrome catching the faint light from the highway half a mile distant, and he sat her on the seat very carefully and dug through his right saddlebag until he found the emergency thermal blanket, silver, crinkly, impractical, and a cereal bar that had been in there since Oklahoma, which she took without hesitation and ate in 4 bites with the single-minded efficiency of serious hunger. "What's your name?" he asked. She chewed, looked at him. "Emma." "Emma. You got a last name?" A pause that was slightly too long. "Collins." "Okay, Emma Collins." He leaned against the fender of the bike and crossed his arms against the cold. "How long have you been back there?" She thought about it with genuine effort, the way children calculate time, which is imprecisely and based on hunger cycles. "A long time," she said finally. "Since before dark." That was at least 6 hours. The temperature had dropped steadily. He looked at her feet inside the oversized boots and tried not to let what he was thinking reach his face. "Is there someone I can call? Parents? Someone who knows where you are?" Emma Collins looked at the cereal bar wrapper in her hands, folded it carefully into a small square. Didn't answer. "Emma, I can't tell you where I came from." She said it quietly, but with a precision that was not childlike. It sounded like something she'd decided, not something she'd been told. "Because if the bad people find out where I am, they'll come." The bad people. Mason filed that away somewhere behind his eyes and let it sit there without pushing on it. He'd learned in the field that some information arrives in its own time, and that pressing accelerates nothing except the breakdown of trust. "Okay," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything right now." He paused. "Are you hurt anywhere, besides cold?" She considered this honestly. "My feet." She looked at the boots. "These aren't mine." "I can see that." "I found them." "You walked here in those?" A nod. She looked up at him. "Is your motorcycle fast?" It was such a left turn that he almost smiled. Fast enough. Where are you going? He'd been asking himself that for the better part of a decade. Right now, somewhere warm. He looked down the highway both directions. The nearest town was Copper Mesa, 14 miles east. He had exactly one person in Copper Mesa he could call at 11:30 on a Thursday night without explanation, and that relationship was complicated in ways he didn't have the energy to quantify in the dark. But Clara would answer. She always answered, even when she was furious with him, which was most of the time. He pulled out his phone. She picked up on the second ring. Mason? Her voice was the same voice it had always been, careful, controlled, carrying the slight tension of a woman who had learned not to expect uncomplicated calls from her brother. It's midnight. I know. Are you hurt? No. A pause. Are you in trouble? No. He looked at the small girl sitting on his motorcycle seat, wrapped in his cut, the silver thermal blanket draped over her legs, looking back at him with those serious, exhausted eyes. I found something. Clara Bennett had spent 31 years as a pediatric nurse before the knees gave out, and the hospital restructured, and she'd taken the early retirement package and moved to the desert town she'd grown up in specifically for the quiet. She had strong opinions about children, about people who failed children, and about her brother, opinions that were layered and complicated and mostly kept to herself. She was waiting on her porch when he pulled up. He'd seen her expression cycle through several versions of itself as he came up the walk carrying Emma. First the clinical assessment, the nurse's inventory of small body, vital signs visible, breathing, responsive. Then something else moving behind her eyes as Emma, who had been dozing against his shoulder, looked up at Clara's porch light and went still. Hi, Emma said. Clara looked at her for a moment, then at Mason, then back at Emma. Hi yourself, she said, and her voice had shifted into something softer and more specific. Are you hungry? I already ate a bar, Emma said seriously. From the saddlebag. It was old. How about something that isn't old? Emma considered this with appropriate gravity. Okay. Clara held the door and didn't say anything else until Emma was inside and the door was closed. Then she turned to Mason in the hallway, and her expression cycled again, the clinical distance dropping away into something raw, something that was part anger and part relief and part the complicated weight of being someone's sister. A child, Mason. I know. You found a child. In the desert. At midnight. Behind the dusty mile. Clara looked at him for a long moment. How long was she alone? Best I can figure, 6 hours minimum, possibly more. Her jaw set. Not at him. At whatever had left a 6-year-old alone in the desert in the cold. Feet? Boots that aren't hers, too big. She walked significant distance. Hypothermia risk? She's coherent, oriented, no shivering now. I had the thermal on her. Clara nodded once. I'll check her. She paused, looked at him. You look terrible. I'm fine. When did you last eat something that wasn't from a saddlebag? He didn't answer. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and went toward the kitchen, where Emma was already sitting at the table, looking around the room with the attentive cataloging gaze of a child who has learned to assess every new space for its relative safety. The stuffed rabbit was on the table in front of her, upright, oriented toward the room. Mason leaned in the doorway and watched his sister move around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly what a frightened child needed, which was warmth and food and normalcy and absolutely no questions yet. He watched Emma watch Clara, watched the slow, almost imperceptible relaxation of the child's shoulders, the way her hands, which had been gripping the edge of the table, gradually loosened. He should have called social services. He knew that. He knew the procedure. He'd navigated it twice before for veterans' kids in crisis situations. Call it in, stay with the child, wait for the caseworker. The system existed for exactly this. The system. He looked at Emma's feet, the boots that weren't hers, the distance she'd walked. He thought about the bad people she'd mentioned with that flat, specific certainty that told him she wasn't embellishing. He thought about what he knew about Copper Mesa's social services, which was limited but not encouraging. He thought about the hour, about how long a caseworker would take to arrive and what the overnight holding facility looked like, and whether Emma Collins would still have that same look in her eyes. Not hope yet, but the last possible version of trust, after 6 hours in a fluorescent room with strangers. "You're staying," Clara said. She wasn't looking at him. She was making hot chocolate. "I wasn't planning." "You found her. You're staying until we figure out the right next step." She turned around. "And before you argue with me about proper channels and official procedures, I wasn't going to." She stopped, looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose you weren't." Emma drank the hot chocolate with both hands wrapped around the mug and didn't say anything for a while. Clara sat across from her and didn't ask anything, just kept the space comfortable and warm and undemanding, and Mason stayed in the doorway and thought about the dusty mile and what a 6-year-old had been doing there, and what she'd seen that had made her call adults bad people with that particular knowing calm. After a while, Emma looked up at Mason. "Is that your house?" "No, my sister's." "She's nice." "She has her moments." Clara gave him a look. Emma almost smiled. Almost. "Will I have to leave tonight?" Emma asked. She was looking at the table when she asked it, at the rabbit standing sentinel in front of her mug. The honest answer was complicated. The legal answer was yes. Eventually, probably. The answer that came out of Mason's mouth was, "Not tonight." Emma nodded. Once. Slowly. Like she was recording it somewhere important. "Can the rabbit stay too?" "The rabbit stays," Mason said. She picked up the mug again. Outside, the desert wind pushed against the windows with a sound like something trying to get in, and the kitchen lights held their own against the dark. In Clara's house, small and quiet and cluttered with medical texts and photographs and the ordinary furniture of a life assembled carefully over decades, was the warmest place Mason Creed had been in longer than he could remember. He should have known it wouldn't stay simple. Nothing in his life stayed simple. And the way Emma had said bad people, not with a child's drama, but with a child's terrible precision, the way you name a thing you have seen clearly and wish you hadn't, was already sitting in the back of his mind like a low frequency he couldn't tune out. By morning, Clara had checked Emma thoroughly and reported no serious injuries beyond mild frostbite at the toe edges and significant exhaustion and dehydration. She'd slept in Clara's guest room for 11 hours straight, the rabbit clutched in the crook of her arm, and when she woke, she asked for breakfast and then asked if she could look at the motorcycle through the window. And Mason stood beside her at the glass and watched her look at it with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Does it make a loud noise?" she asked. "Depends how you treat it." "What if you treat it good?" "Then it sounds like it means something," he said. She thought about that, pressed her hand briefly against the cold glass, then turned and went to find Clara, and Mason stayed at the window looking out at the bike in the morning light and the empty street and the flat desert sprawl beyond, and he felt the particular weight of a situation that was already past the point where he could step back out of it. He just didn't know yet how far in he'd already stepped. That afternoon, while Emma was sleeping again, her body making up for what the desert had taken, Mason drove back to the dusty mile, alone. Left the bike at the road and walked the lot on foot, methodical, the way he'd learned to clear a space. Not looking for anything specific, just looking. The crates where she'd been hiding were still there. He crouched beside them and found what he expected. The compressed outline in the dirt where she'd been curled, a small depression, some food wrapper he didn't recognize, a child's sneaker, one, just one, without a lace. He found the other things by accident. Around the side of the building, on the loading dock, the concrete was scraped in ways that suggested recent vehicle activity. Tire marks. Multiple vehicles. Fresh enough that the desert dust hadn't fully reclaimed them. There was a dark stain on the dock surface that could have been oil or could have been something else, and he looked at it for a long time before straightening. He looked at the desert behind the diner. Open country for 20 miles. A child running from the loading dock would have had nowhere to go except into that. And she'd run far enough and long enough to end up in the crates. Running from something she'd seen on that dock. Mason stood in the thin afternoon light behind the dusty mile diner and felt the situation solidify around him in the particular way he recognized from the years when solidifying situations had been his profession. When the geometry of a moment locked into place, and you understood that the variables had already finished arranging themselves, and what remained was only action or inaction, and inaction was its own kind of decision. His phone buzzed. Clara. She's asking for you. He looked at the loading dock one more time, took 3 photographs with his phone, walked back to his bike. He didn't know yet what Emma Collins had seen behind this building. He didn't know who the bad people were or how deep their reach went in a small desert town like Copper Mesa, or whether they knew a child had witnessed them and survived. What he did know, standing in the empty lot with the cold coming back into the air and the desert going red at the edges, was that someone had left a 6-year-old girl in the dark to die of exposure rather than deal with what she'd seen. And somewhere in this town, those people were still going about their business, comfortable in the certainty that the problem had solved itself. They didn't know about Mason Creed yet. They didn't know what he'd already promised a child without words. What he'd promised the moment he went down on one knee in the frozen gravel and unzipped his jacket and said, "I'm not going anywhere." He started the bike. The engine caught with a sound that rolled out across the empty lot and died against the desert silence, and he sat there for a moment with his hands on the bars and the cold moving through his thermal, thinking about what came next. His phone buzzed again. She drew something. "You need to see it." Mason Creed pulled out of the Dusty Mile parking lot and pointed the bike toward Copper Mesa, and somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the tactical assessment and the old veteran's calm, something older and more elemental had already woken up and was watching the road ahead with very quiet, very steady eyes. The drawing was waiting on Clara's kitchen table when he got back. Emma had used Clara's colored pencils, the good ones she kept for her own occasional evenings, and she'd drawn with the focused, unself-conscious intensity of a child who is putting something outside herself because it's too large to keep inside. Mason stood over the table and looked at it. Clara stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. The drawing showed a building, square, simple, the way children render structures, and behind it, 2 large shapes that were clearly vehicles, and in front of the vehicles, small stick figures, some standing, some not, and off to the side, near the edge of the paper, a very small figure running, alone, into a wide space of blue and white crayon that might have been sky or might have been cold. The small figure had yellow hair. Emma was in the doorway. She'd been watching them look at it. When Mason turned, her face was very still, and she was holding the rabbit by one ear the way children hold things when they're prepared for the possibility of flight. "That's what I saw," she said, "from behind the boxes." Mason looked at her, at the drawing, at Clara, who looked back at him with an expression that contained everything she wasn't saying, and all of it mattered. "Emma," he said carefully, "were any of the people in your drawing wearing anything, like a uniform or a jacket or—" "Yes," she said. She stepped forward and pointed to 2 of the stick figures near the vehicles. Someone had put careful, precise brown marks on their chests. "Badges," she said, "like police." The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the desert wind pressed against the glass, and Mason Creed understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who has spent his life recognizing the exact moment when something shifts from bad to much worse, that Emma Collins hadn't just witnessed something dangerous. She had witnessed something protected. The drawing stayed on the kitchen table like an indictment. Mason didn't touch it. He stood over it with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was the thing that exists on the other side of calm, after you've burned through the adrenaline and the anger and arrived somewhere colder and more deliberate. Clara stood beside the counter with a dish towel in her hands that she'd forgotten she was holding. Emma had retreated to the doorway, again, watching them both the way she watched everything, with that particular attentiveness of a child who has learned that the behavior of adults in quiet rooms often determines what happens to her next. "Badges," Mason said again. Not a question. Just the word, set down carefully. "2 of them," Emma said. "They had the silver ones, not the yellow kind." Clara looked at Mason. He didn't look back at her. He was looking at the drawing, at the 2 stick figures with the precise brown marks on their chests, at the vehicles behind the building that were clearly large, SUVs or trucks, not cruisers, and at the small yellow-haired figure running toward the edge of the paper like she was trying to exit the story entirely. "Emma." He turned around slowly and crouched to her eye level. The men with the badges, did they see you? She thought about it. The rabbit came up slightly, instinctive. One of them looked, she said, when I knocked the box. He looked at where I was hiding. Did he come after you? He started to. She swallowed. But the other man, the one without the badge, he said something and the badge man stopped. And then they looked at each other, and then... She trailed off, pressed the rabbit against her chin. And then I ran. You did exactly the right thing, Mason said. He said it quietly, without performance, and whatever was in his voice when he said it, some frequency below words, made Emma's shoulders drop a half inch. You did everything exactly right. He stood back up. Clara caught his eye and tilted her head toward the hallway, and he followed her out of the kitchen, leaving Emma at the table with the colored pencils and the drawing and the rabbit standing watch. In the hallway, Clara kept her voice low and precise. You understand what she's describing? Yeah. Local law, Mason. Minimum 1. Possibly more. I understand what she's describing. Then you understand why calling the sheriff's office is not an option right now. I know. Clara pressed her fingers to her forehead. 31 years of pediatric nursing had given her a particular relationship with crisis, the ability to function inside it without flinching while still feeling every dimension of it, and he could see that machinery operating behind her eyes. We can go to the state level, bypass local entirely. I have contacts from my hospital years, victim advocates who work directly with... Not yet. She stopped, looked at him. What does that mean, not yet? It means I need 48 hours to understand what we're actually dealing with before we put her name into any system where the wrong person might see it. He kept his voice level. If there's a local badge involved in whatever happened at that diner, they have access to intake records, missing persons reports, everything that gets filed locally. The moment Emma Collins becomes an official name in an official file, she becomes findable, Clara said. Yeah. The hallway went quiet. The house settled around them, the small sounds of a desert night, the refrigerator cycling, the wind at the eaves. 48 hours, Clara said. 48 hours I understand what I'm looking at. Then we do this the right way, with people we can verify. Clara looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd been refining since they were children, the one that meant she had 14 objections and was choosing to file them rather than deploy them, because she understood that sometimes the situation had already made the decision and what remained was only execution. She needs consistency, she said finally. Routine, calm. Whatever you're doing in those 48 hours, she cannot see it. She cannot feel the panic. Understood. And Mason. She waited until he looked at her directly. If this goes where I think it might go, if there are people in this town who know a witness survived, you cannot handle that alone. He didn't answer. You have people, she said. Call them. He looked away down the hallway toward the kitchen, where Emma had climbed back onto the chair and was adding something to the drawing with a green pencil, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. I'll make some calls, he said. That's not the same as what I said. Clara. I know. She reached out and briefly gripped his arm, the gesture so rare from her that it registered like a seismic event. Then she let go and went back to the kitchen, and Mason stood in the hallway for a moment with his hands at his sides, and the weight of the evening settling into the muscles of his shoulders like accumulated mileage. He went outside, stood on the porch in the cold with his phone and looked at the dark street and the desert beyond, and the sprawl of Copper Mesa's modest skyline, a water tower, a cellular antenna, the red light on top of the grain elevator that blinked once every 4 seconds in the dark. He'd grown up 40 miles from here. He'd left at 19 to join the army and come back at 43 having shed most of what 19 had felt like. And he'd stayed in the region without exactly knowing why. Proximity to something he couldn't name. A magnetic pull he'd stopped fighting. He pulled up a contact and made the call. It rang 4 times. Then, you know what time it is? I know. I'm going to assume this isn't social. Rourke. He paused. I need a conversation, not on the phone. A silence on the other end that was doing a lot of work. Rourke Gallagher had been the president of the Iron Hollow Riders for 11 years, and before that he'd been a Marine combat engineer for 14, and the combination had produced a man who processed information the way good machinery processes stress, quietly, completely, with very little wasted motion. "Tomorrow morning," Rourke said. "The shop. 8. 7. Another pause. 7, Rourke agreed and ended the call. Mason put the phone in his pocket and stood on the porch and let the cold work on him for a while, because sometimes that was the only thing that cut through the noise. Down the street, a dog was barking at something or nothing. The desert beyond the last house was perfectly, completely dark, the kind of darkness that city people find terrifying and that Mason had come to find clarifying. Somewhere in that town, at least one person who wore a badge knew that a child had seen something behind the dusty mile and had run. And either they'd decided the cold had handled the problem or they were still looking. He went inside, checked the locks on Clara's doors without making a production of it, stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway while Clara helped Emma wash the colored pencil off her hands at the sink, both of them talking quietly about the rabbit. Emma explaining his name was Professor Hops, which he'd had since before she could remember, and Clara receiving this information with appropriate seriousness. And the domesticity of the scene was so complete and so fragile that Mason felt it like pressure against his sternum. He made up the couch for himself without being asked. He didn't sleep much. He didn't expect to. The Iron Hollow Writers' shop sat on the eastern edge of Copper Mesa, where the commercial district gave up pretending and became a row of industrial buildings and chain-link lots, a block of auto repair places, and a welding supply and a tire warehouse. The shop itself was a converted truck garage, 2 bays wide, with the club's name in iron lettering above the door, and a hand-painted mural on the side wall that had been done 12 years ago by a member named Castillo, who'd lost 3 fingers in Fallujah and painted with the remaining 7 better than most people managed with 10. Mason parked in front at 6:58. He sat on the bike for a moment and looked at the building and thought about the last time he'd been here, which was 7 months ago and had ended badly in ways that hadn't been entirely resolved. The relationship between Mason Creed and the Iron Hollow Riders was a long, complicated sentence with too many clauses and not enough periods, and he'd never found a clean way to summarize it for anyone who asked. He'd founded the chapter. 14 years ago, coming off his second deployment, 3 months out of a VA hospital, with a diagnosis he'd spent 2 years refusing to say out loud. He'd built it from 4 members: himself, Rourke, a man named Dex, who was dead now, and a woman named Santos who'd moved to Albuquerque and started her own chapter. He'd built it as the thing the VA couldn't be, which was a room full of people who understood each other's particular damage without requiring explanation, who showed up when the phone didn't get answered and made sure nobody went down alone. And then 6 years ago, he'd stepped back. Not cleanly, nothing clean about it. A decision made at the end of a bad year, a series of choices that had fractured things. With Rourke, with the charter, with himself. And he'd kept his patch and kept his distance and done his work sideways, the underground kind, helping veterans' families and running supplies to shelters and doing the things the chapter would have done officially if he'd let himself stay inside it. He got off the bike and went inside. Rourke was at the workbench. He was a big man, Mason's height, wider, carrying the weight of his 50s in a way that looked structural rather than incidental, with a shaved head and a beard going white at the jaw and forearms that looked like they'd been designed for a purpose and had spent 40 years fulfilling it. He had a transmission part in his hands that he didn't look up from when Mason came in. 3 other men were in the shop. Denny Flores at the far bay, working under a bike on a lift. Garrett Cole by the coffee machine, watching Mason arrive with the particular watchfulness of a man who had been briefed that the arrival was complicated. And against the back wall, arms crossed, saying nothing, a newer member whose name Mason knew was Briggs, mid-30s, the tight, compressed stillness of someone who'd done infantry and never fully decompressed. Mason stood in the middle of the floor, let the room settle around him. "Coffee's there," Rourke said, still not looking up. "I'm fine." Wasn't an invitation, it was a location report. Rourke set down the part and finally turned. His eyes moved over Mason the way experienced men's eyes do, cataloging without performing the catalog. "You look like you drove all night." "Most of it." "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." Rourke studied him. You call at midnight and want to 7 a.m. Meeting, Creed. You're going to sit down and drink the coffee and tell me what's happening without the armor on, because I don't have the patience for the armor this early. Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he went to the coffee machine and poured a cup and pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat on it. Garrett watched this sequence with the carefully neutral expression of a man trying not to have a visible reaction to something unexpected. I found a child last night, Mason said. 6 years old, alone at the Dusty Mile. She'd been there at minimum 6 hours in the cold. The shop went quiet in a specific way, not empty quiet. The quiet of men who have learned not to respond to information immediately, who have been in enough situations where the first response was also the wrong one. She's with Clara now, Mason continued. She's okay. Mild frostbite, dehydration, nothing she won't recover from. What happened to her? Rourke asked. Mason wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She witnessed something, behind the diner. A meeting of some kind, vehicles, multiple individuals. He paused. At least one of them was law enforcement. Nobody moved. She drew it, Mason said. Badges, 2 of them. She was specific. Rourke looked at him for a long time. The transmission part was still on the workbench between them, and the fluorescent light above it buzzed faintly, and outside a truck went by on the street and the sound of it moved through the building and faded. You're sure about what she saw, Rourke said. I'm not sure of anything yet. That's why I'm here. I need eyes and ears, Rourke. I need people I trust to help me understand what's moving in this town before I put that little girl's name into any official channel. Garrett set his coffee cup down. What kind of exchange are we talking about? At the diner. I don't know yet. The doc showed vehicle activity, fresh tire marks, a stain I couldn't identify. The child was too frightened to give me detail, and I'm not going to push her. How long until she talks? Garrett asked. When she's ready. Mason looked at him. Not before. Garrett held his gaze and then looked away, which was its own kind of answer. Rourke had turned back to the workbench. He picked up the transmission part and turned it in his hands, not working on it, just handling it, the way some men handle objects when they're processing. You know what you're asking, he said. Yeah. You're asking this club to position itself between an unknown number of individuals, at least one of whom has a badge and has already demonstrated willingness to leave a child in the desert to die, and a 6-year-old witness who currently exists in your sister's house unofficially with no legal protection framework, in a jurisdiction where the local law may be compromised. He set the part down, looked at Mason. You understand that's what you're describing. I understand that's what I'm describing. And you come to me. Rourke's voice stayed flat, but there was something moving underneath it. After 6 years of mostly not being here. There it was. Mason had been waiting for it. He held it without flinching. After 6 years, he said. Yeah. You want to tell me why you get to do that? No, Mason said. I don't think I do. I think I'm asking anyway. The shop held its breath. Briggs against the back wall hadn't moved, but his eyes were tracking the conversation with an attentiveness that said he understood he was watching something that predated him. Rourke was quiet for what felt like a significant duration. Then he made a sound that was not a sigh, and was not quite a laugh, and was the specific sound of a man accepting a situation he hasn't decided to accept yet. Denny, he said. Denny Flores rolled out from under the bike on his back, looking up at the ceiling. Yeah. What do you know about the Dusty Mile property? Denny sat up, wiped his hands on a shop rag. Sold 8 months ago. Holding company, I think. Nobody local. He paused. There's been truck traffic out there the last few weeks. I noticed driving by. Didn't think much of it. What kind of trucks? Big. Refrigerated, maybe. Or just plain cargo. Hard to tell in the dark. Mason turned this over. Refrigerated. In the desert. At a closed diner. The geometry of it wasn't pointing anywhere good. I need the ownership chain on that property, Mason said. And I need to know who in the local department has been running late shifts the last month. That second thing is sensitive, Garrett said. I know it is. We start pulling at that thread, people notice. Then we pull carefully. Garrett looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Mason. The moment had the particular weight of a decision that everyone in the room understood was not reversible once made. This was the thing Mason had tried to explain to people outside these walls and never found adequate words for. The way a group of men who have been through the worst iterations of human experience together develop a collective sense of gravity around decisions, a shared understanding of exactly how much a choice costs. 48 hours, Rourke said finally. We gather information only. Nobody confronts anybody. Nobody announces anything. Nobody acts without coming back to this room first. He looked at Mason with something that was equal parts old partnership and unresolved grievance. And you stay in contact every few hours. You don't go dark. You don't make unilateral moves. You're not out there alone on this. Agreed. I need to hear it like you mean it, Creed. Mason met his eyes. I won't go dark, he said. I won't move alone. A long pause. Then Rourke nodded once. The matter was decided. The shop exhaled. The next 24 hours operated at 2 speeds simultaneously. Inside Clara's house, time moved slowly and carefully, the way it moves around a child in recovery. Emma ate breakfast and asked to see the motorcycle again, and Mason sat with her on the porch steps in the thin morning sun and let her ask him questions about how engines worked, answering each one with the flat patience he didn't always have for adults and seemed to locate automatically for her. She had the rabbit. She had the colored pencils. She had Clara's quiet kitchen and the specific safety of a space where no one was demanding anything from her. She asked him once, obliquely, whether the people from the diner knew where she was. No, he said. They don't know you're here. How do you know? He looked at her. Because this is my town, he said, and I'm paying attention. She considered this. Then she went back to the question she'd been asking about carburetors, and he went back to answering, and neither of them acknowledged the thing that had just been said, the weight of it, the promise embedded in it. But he felt it settle between them like a handshake. Outside the house, things moved faster and with less gentleness. Denny Flores had a contact in the county assessor's office who owed him a favor from an incident 3 years back that neither of them discussed publicly, and by noon he had the ownership chain on the Dusty Mile property printed on a piece of paper that he brought to the shop without making any calls to do it. The holding company was called Meridian Property Group LLC, registered in Delaware, with a managing agent in Phoenix. The managing agent's name connected, after 2 more degrees of separation, to a name that appeared on the donor list for the last 2 Copper Mesa municipal election cycles. It was circumstantial. It was also the kind of circumstantial that pointed in a direction. Garrett Cole had done something more careful and more dangerous. He had a cousin who worked civilian admin at the sheriff's department, scheduling, not badge, and over a lunch that was entirely unremarkable and social on its surface, he'd navigated a conversation about recent overtime patterns. 2 deputies in particular had been logging late hours in a sector that included the Route 9 corridor. Both were relatively recent hires, both from out of county, both assigned to Sergeant Dale Pruitt's rotation. Pruitt. Mason knew the name. Not well. Enough to have a shape. He was at the shop when Garrett reported this, sitting on the same stool with the second cup of coffee, and when he heard Pruitt's name, he felt something cold and specific move through him. Not fear. The recognition of a particular type of person, the kind who has learned to use the architecture of authority as camouflage for things that wouldn't survive exposure. Pruitt's been here 6 years, Mason said. 7, Garrett said. Came from out west. Mineral County somewhere. He have any heat, any complaints? Nothing that went anywhere official. Nothing that went anywhere official. Mason turned that phrase in his mind. Rourke was listening from across the shop. This is still circumstantial, he said. We have a property with a holding company. We have a sergeant with late shift deputies. We don't have a direct line. We have a 6-year-old who drew badges, Mason said, which is not evidence in any form that protects her. Not yet. The words sat there. Mason stood up, walked to the bay door and looked out at the street. A minivan went by. A woman walking a dog. The entirely ordinary midday life of a small desert town that had no idea what was sitting inside it. He thought about Emma on the porch steps with her questions about carburetors, her voice when she asked whether the bad people knew where she was, the quality of trust she'd extended to him, not because he'd earned it in any conventional sense, but because she had nothing else left to extend it to, and sometimes that's the only way trust happens, when all the alternatives have been used up. He thought about the stick figure in her drawing, running toward the edge of the paper. "There's something else," Garrett said. Mason turned around. Garrett had his phone in his hands. He looked uncomfortable in the way that Garrett Cole, who was not a man who frequently looked uncomfortable, occasionally looked when information forced him toward a position he hadn't wanted to occupy. "I asked around about the diner. Quiet, just casual." He paused. 2 weeks ago, a 16-year-old from the east side told his football coach he'd seen something weird out on Route 9. Trucks at the Dusty Mile at 2 in the morning. Coach told him to stay out of it. Kid didn't pursue it. Mason waited. "The kid's name is Marcus Webb," Garrett said. "Last Thursday, he didn't show up to practice. His mother reported him missing Friday morning." He looked up from the phone. "Sheriff's Department logged the report. It's been assigned to Pruitt's rotation." The shop went to a particular quality of silence that Mason recognized from very specific moments in very specific places. The silence that happens when a situation reveals its actual scale, and the scale is larger and worse than the prior estimate. "A teenager," Rourke said quietly. "Missing 4 days," Garrett said. Mason's arms had gone very still at his sides. He was looking at the floor, processing, running the geometry. A teenager who'd seen the trucks, a 6-year-old who'd witnessed what the trucks were connected to, a missing persons report assigned to the rotation of the man whose deputies had been working the Route 9 sector. "The child is a witness," Mason said. His voice was flat, deliberate. "And if they're aware she survived, she's not just a loose end. She's a liability that needs resolution." "You don't know they're aware," Rourke said. "I know someone looked toward the crates," Mason said. "I know a teenager is missing after seeing the same location. I know the missing person report went to Pruitt." He looked up. "I know Emma Collins has been in my sister's house for 18 hours, and nobody has come looking for a lost child through any official channel." Another silence. "If she was genuinely just a lost child," Garrett said slowly, "there'd be a report, parents calling, something." "Yeah," Mason said, "which means either she has no one to report her missing, or the people who know she's missing don't want her found," Mason said. "They want her not found." Rourke stood with his arms crossed and his jaw working slightly, the tell Mason had learned to read over 14 years, the thing Rourke did when he was deciding something he didn't want to decide. "I'm going to ask you a question," he said, "and I need an honest answer." "Ask." "Where is Emma Collins from? You said she wouldn't tell you, but you've had 18 hours and you're good at reading people. What's your read?" Mason exhaled. "She's not from here," he said. "Her speech pattern is slightly different, and she's been in a situation long enough to have adaptation behaviors. She knows to be quiet. She knows how to compress herself. She knows how to assess exits. That's learned, Rourke. Kids don't develop that naturally." He paused. "I think someone was responsible for her, and I think whatever happened at the Dusty Mile may be connected to how she came to be there." The weight of that sat on everyone in the room differently. Briggs, who had not spoken since Mason arrived, spoke now from his position against the back wall. His voice was quiet and direct. "We talking about trafficking?" Not a question. A label being applied to a shape that had been forming for the last 10 minutes. Nobody answered him because the answer was implicit in everything already said. Mason looked at the floor for a moment. Then he raised his eyes and looked at Rourke. "I need to move Clara and the girl tonight," he said. "Not far. Just out of the obvious location. Somewhere quiet that isn't on record." "I know a place," Rourke said immediately. "Santos's old property, East Canyon Road. It's been empty since she left. The title's still in the club's name. Nobody's looking there." "That works. I'll send Briggs and Denny with you." "I don't need—" "Mason," Rourke's voice cut through without raising. "I need to hear you say it." A beat. The old resistance in him. The specific, stubborn damage of a man who had spent too long equating help with weakness. He felt it, felt the familiar pull toward alone, toward contained, toward the version of himself that had driven away from this club 6 years ago because alone was easier than accountable. He thought about Emma asking him if the bad people knew where she was. "Okay," he said. "Briggs and Denny." Rourke nodded. Something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness exactly, but was in that neighborhood, something that acknowledged 6 years without requiring a full accounting of them right now. "I want Garrett on Pruitt," Mason said. "Distance. Nothing close, just pattern. His movements, his vehicle, anything irregular." "Done," Garrett said. "And the Webb kid." He looked at Garrett. "Quietly put eyes on the family. If Marcus is alive and in contact with anyone, it'll come through the mother first." "On it." Mason picked up his jacket from the workbench. He stood there for a moment with it in his hands and looked around the shop, the worn floor, the good tools on the pegboard, the Castillo mural visible through the open bay door, the iron lettering above the entrance, the thing he'd built and then walked away from and was now standing in the middle of again with a 6-year-old girl's drawing of stick figures and police badges in the pocket of his thermal. Some part of him had known, when he went down on one knee in the dark behind the dusty mile, that the direction his life was pointing in had changed. He hadn't known yet how completely, how many layers down it would go. He put his jacket on. "One more thing," Rourke said. Mason turned. Rourke looked at him with an expression he'd seen before and hadn't been able to name until now. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something and was about to put half of it down. "6 years ago," Rourke said, "when you left. The reason—" "Rourke, I'm not asking for an accounting. I'm telling you something." He paused. "I should have come after you. That's on me. What went wrong between you and this club? There was more than one person's fingerprints on it, and I let you walk because it was easier than sitting in it." He held Mason's gaze. "That's all I wanted to say." Mason stood with that for a moment. The shop around them was very still. Outside, a bird was making a sound on the roof that was almost musical. "You came," Mason said finally. "I called you at midnight and you came." He paused. "We can leave the rest there for now." Rourke nodded. Once. Mason went to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. He'd been going to say something, about the plan, about timing, about the logistics of the move tonight. Instead, what came out was, "She told me his name, the rabbit. Professor Hops." He looked at Rourke without turning his body, just the look. "She hasn't told me her last name voluntarily, hasn't told me where she came from, but she told me the rabbit's name inside the first hour." Rourke watched him. "That's what we're working with," Mason said. "That's what we're protecting." He went out into the street. The cold hit him clean, and he stood beside his bike for a moment and looked both ways down the road, the habit of a man who'd learned to know his environment, and then he saw the thing that cracked the last manageable version of the situation open completely. A sheriff's department cruiser was parked half a block down on the opposite side of the street, facing this direction, engine running, and behind the wheel, just visible through the windshield, a man in a uniform who wasn't doing anything, not writing, not on his radio, not looking at a phone, just sitting there, watching the front of the Iron Hollow Rider's shop with the patient, settled stillness of a man doing exactly what he'd been sent to do. Mason didn't look directly, looked past, memorized the plate number in his peripheral vision, and turned to his bike and put on his helmet with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who hadn't seen anything. His hands were completely steady. Inside, something cold and clean and very old had finished waking up. They already knew he existed. They'd had eyes on the shop, which meant someone had connected the dots faster than he'd anticipated. The diner, the missing child, the biker who'd been known to operate in that corridor. It meant the 48 hours he'd given himself might already be down to 48 hours he'd given himself might already be down to nothing. He didn't get on the bike. He stood beside it with his helmet in his hands and looked down at the asphalt between his boots and did the calculation with the precision of a man who had spent years in situations where the speed of the calculation determined whether you went home. The cruiser was a block away, engine running. That meant whoever was in it was either communicating or ready to move. If they'd wanted to confront him, they'd have done it already. This was surveillance, which meant they weren't certain yet, certain of what he knew, what he had, where the child was. They were watching to see where he went next, which meant he could not go to Clara's house. He put his helmet on, started the bike, pulled out of the lot heading west, away from Clara's, away from the canyon road, away from everything that mattered. He took the first right, then another, threading through the residential grid with the calm deliberateness of a man going nowhere in particular, and in his mirror the cruiser did not appear, and did not appear, and then appeared, 2 blocks back, keeping distance. Mason rode west for another 6 minutes until he reached the Copper Mesa Public Library, which was open because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays in small towns are unremarkable, and he parked in the lot beside 3 other cars and went inside with his helmet under his arm like a man returning a book, and he found a chair at a table near the back window where he could see the lot, and sat in it and took out his phone. He texted Rourke. 3 words. Tail, library, now. Then he texted Clara from a different number. The backup line he'd set up years ago for exactly the kind of situation he'd hoped never to be in. Don't open the door for anyone. Check the back window. Tell me what you see on the street. He waited. Watched the lot through the window. The cruiser was parked on the street outside, not in the lot. The driver hadn't gotten out. Clara texted back in 4 minutes. White pickup. Parked across from the mailbox. Been there an hour at least. I thought it was the Hendersons' contractor. Mason looked at the ceiling of the Copper Mesa Public Library. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A child 2 tables away was reading with her finger moving under the words, and the librarian was reshelving something in the 300 section, and the ordinary sediment of Tuesday afternoon life continued to deposit itself around him without any awareness of what was sitting in it. 2 vehicles. One on him, one on Clara's house, which meant this was not improvised and was not preliminary. This was a coordinated watch, which meant someone with organizational capacity and access to department resources had authorized it, which meant Pruitt, or someone above Pruitt, had made a decision. The decision was not good for Emma Collins. Rourke came through the library's front door 11 minutes later in civilian clothes, a canvas work jacket, no cut, ball cap, and sat across from Mason without greeting him and looked at the window. Cruiser on the street, Mason said quietly. I saw it. Rourke's voice was level. White truck on your sister's block, too. Denny just texted me. He did a pass. Yeah, Clara confirmed. Rourke looked at his hands on the table. The hands of a man who had built engines and buried friends and made hard decisions in bad rooms. They moved faster than you thought. A lot faster. How? Mason had been working on that since the parking lot. The shop had been the only place he'd gone that morning that connected him to anything. But the shop was known. The club's address was public. It wasn't a secret location. Anyone who knew Mason Creed's associations would know to watch it. The question was when they'd made the connection between him and the child. Either someone saw me at the diner last night, he said, or they picked up my plate somewhere on Route 9 and ran it. Either way, they have my name. And my name connects to the club, and the club connects to... Clara, Rourke said. Yeah. A pause. The librarian moved through the 400s. The child with the moving finger turned a page. The girl needs to move in the next 2 hours, Rourke said, before whoever is in that truck decides watching is enough. I know, but I can't go there. My face puts a tail on whatever car leaves that house. Denny can go. He's clean. No connection to your sister. Is he sure he wasn't followed from the shop? Rourke sent a text, got one back in 90 seconds. He looped twice. He's clean. Okay, Mason thought. Santos's property, Canyon Road. Denny takes Clara and Emma now, the back way, Mesquite Road to the old fire access. It'll add 40 minutes, but it avoids the main grid. I'll send Briggs to meet them there. Not in club colors. Understood. Rourke was already texting. His thumbs moved with the efficient, unsentimental speed of a man who had run enough operations to have stripped the hesitation out of the logistics. What are you doing? I'm going to stay visible, Mason said. I'm going to sit here another 20 minutes, then ride to the diner on 5th for lunch like a man with nothing to hide, and let whoever is in that cruiser follow me around town while Denny moves Clara. He paused. And while that's happening, I need Garrett to have found something concrete. Because we're past the information gathering phase. Rourke looked up from his phone. What changed? 2 vehicles on simultaneous surveillance inside 12 hours of a missing child report. That's not routine. He stopped, recalculated, started again. That's protection of an active operation. Whoever is running those vehicles isn't investigating Emma's disappearance. They're containing the fallout from whatever she saw. Those are 2 completely different things, Rourke, and I should have named it sooner. Rourke sat with that. Outside, the cruiser hadn't moved. "I'll get Garrett," he said. "What do you need from him?" The name on the Meridian Property Group's managing agent in Phoenix, and whether that name has any connection to cases that went cold in the last 3 years involving, he looked at the table, involving children. Rourke went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man who had already been thinking in the same direction and hadn't wanted to say it first. "You're certain that's what this is?" "Emma's been in a situation long enough to develop survival behaviors," Mason said. "She appeared at a location being used for covert nighttime logistics with refrigerated transport. A teenager who saw the same location is missing, and whoever is running the watch on Clara's house isn't looking for a lost child. They're looking for a loose end." He looked at Rourke directly. "Yeah, I'm certain." Rourke stood up. He straightened his jacket. His face had done something, rearranged itself into an expression Mason recognized from the worst nights. The nights when the thing they were doing stopped being about mechanics and started being about something that didn't have an adequate word for it, something that operated below strategy and above instinct. Fury that has passed through heat and come out the other side cold. "I'll get Garrett," he said. He left the library without looking back. Mason sat at the table in the Copper Mesa Public Library and watched the cruiser on the street and listened to the fluorescent lights buzz and felt the shape of the next 48 hours arranging itself in his mind like a landscape seen from altitude. The features visible, the distances still uncertain, the terrain between here and any version of safety looking very long and very rough. He thought about Emma asking whether the bad people knew where she was. He thought about the certainty with which he'd said no. He was going to have to be right about that. He was going to have to make it true retroactively, which was the hardest way to make anything true. He sat for 20 minutes. Then he went to lunch. The diner on 5th was called Carla's, and it had been there since before Mason was born, and the woman behind the counter, whose name was not Carla but Bev, had been there almost as long and had the look of someone who had outlasted every version of drama this town had produced and found none of it particularly surprising. Mason ordered eggs and coffee and a side of toast and ate with the methodical joylessness of a man fueling a machine, watching the window, watching the cruiser that had parked across the street with the same settled patience as before. Different driver, he thought. Slightly different parking angle. They'd swapped out, which meant this was shift work, which meant department resources committed for duration. That was significant. That was someone spending organizational capital. His phone buzzed. Denny. "Package delivered. Everyone good. Briggs on site." He exhaled through his nose, drank the coffee, let Bev refill it without being asked. His phone buzzed again. "Garrett. Call when you can. Not text." Mason left cash on the table, enough to cover it twice, the way he always did, and walked to the back of the diner and out the side door into the alley and called Garrett. Garrett picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" "Alley behind Carla's." "Okay." A pause that was doing a lot of work. "I got the Phoenix name. Managing agent for Meridian is a man named Victor Sell. He's got a real estate license, legitimate business, nothing unusual on the surface." Another pause. "Underneath the surface is different. Talk to me." Victor Sell was the subject of a federal investigation 3 years ago. Child welfare adjacent. He was a licensed placement coordinator for a private foster care company operating in 4 states. The investigation was opened, ran 14 months, then quietly closed. No charges. The company restructured, and the license was transferred to a new entity. Mason leaned his back against the alley wall. The cold of the brick came through his jacket. "The company that absorbed the license," Garrett continued, "is currently operating in 6 states. Copper Mesa is in their service region." The alley smelled like grease and cold air and the distant diesel of a truck several streets over. Mason looked at the blank wall across from him and felt the information land and arrange itself and become something that had a shape and a direction and an ugliness that was specific rather than general. Emma came through a placement system, he said. It wasn't a question. That's my read, Garrett said. I can't confirm without her records, and she doesn't have records that I can find under Collins, which means Collins might not be her legal name. Or she doesn't have a legal name in any system that would surface easily. Yeah. Garrett. The Phoenix name? Cell. Does he have any connection to Copper Mesa directly? Any property? Any... He's on the Copper Mesa Economic Development Advisory Board, Garrett said, appointed 2 years ago. He shows up at meetings twice a year, contributes to local candidates. Nothing visible. He paused. He also had dinner at the Copper Mesa Steakhouse 3 weeks ago. I found a mention of it in the local paper's society column. He was there with Sergeant Dale Pruitt and a county commissioner named Hargrove. The alley was very quiet. 3 weeks ago, Mason said, 2 weeks before the teenage boy reported seeing trucks at the Dusty Mile. 1 week before his disappearance. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, not from shock, from the particular exhaustion of having a shape fully reveal itself and finding that the shape was even worse than the outline had suggested. An advisory board member, a local sergeant, a county commissioner, a property company, a closed federal investigation, a private placement network operating across 6 states. This wasn't a local corruption problem. This was infrastructure. Rourke needs to hear this in person, Mason said. Already on my way to the shop, Garrett said. But Mason, he stopped. There's one more thing. The tone of it, the specific flatness, the reluctance, made Mason go still. Tell me, he said, the federal investigation that closed 3 years ago, the one on Cell. Garrett's voice had something in it that Mason hadn't heard from him before, a quality that wasn't quite controlled. I got a partial case summary from a contact who works adjacent to federal systems. Don't ask me how, I won't tell you. But the investigation was closed because the lead agent was pulled off the case, transferred out. The official reason was internal reorganization. And the unofficial reason? The lead agent made a complaint, said the case had been compromised, said someone with visibility into the investigation was passing information to the subjects. He paused. The complaint went to the agent's supervisor. 3 weeks later, the case was closed and the agent was transferred to a field office in Alaska. Mason said nothing. The lead agent's name, Garrett said, was Karen Creed. The alley performed a particular silence that Mason had never experienced before. Not the silence of tactical stillness or emotional distance or the exhaustion of grief, but the silence of the world pivoting on a point so abrupt that the sound hadn't caught up with the motion yet. Karen Creed, his daughter. She'd been 29 when she'd joined the federal service. He'd been proud in the specific, painful way fathers are proud of things that prove their children are better than they deserve. They'd been estranged for 3 of those years, the fault lines of a man who'd been largely absent and had arrived late and imperfectly to the project of fathering. But they'd been rebuilding something, careful, slow, the way you rebuild things that have been down long enough that you can't use the original materials. She'd transferred to Alaska 18 months ago. He'd taken it at face value because she'd told him it was a good opportunity, and he hadn't pushed because pushing was not the relationship they'd developed. He'd sent her a card at Christmas. She'd called him in the spring, a conversation that had been warm in the cautious way their conversations were warm, and she hadn't told him anything about any of this. She'd been pulled off a case. She'd made a complaint about compromise. She'd been transferred to Alaska. And 3 weeks ago in Copper Mesa, the man whose investigation she'd been running had dinner with a local sergeant and a county commissioner. Mason turned and put his hand flat against the brick wall of the alley and stood there with his weight on it and breathed. Mason, Garrett said. Yeah. I didn't know she was your... No, it's okay. He straightened, took his hand off the wall. Does she know about this? About what's happening here? I don't know. I just found the connection 20 minutes ago. Okay, he thought. Don't tell Rourke yet. I need to... He stopped, reconsidered. Tell Rourke. He needs the full picture, but I need to reach her first. Understood. And Garrett, he paused. Good work. All of it. He ended the call. stood in the alley with the cold and the smell of grease and a piece of information that had rearranged everything that had seemed personal about the situation and revealed it to be structural instead, or perhaps both. Personal and structural at once, layered the way the worst things are layered, where the private damage and the public corruption have been growing in the same soil all along without either knowing about the other. He called Karen's number. It went to voicemail after 2 rings, the specific pattern of a call being declined rather than missed. He left no message, sent a text instead. "It's Dad. I'm in Copper Mesa. I need to talk to you about Victor's cell. Call me on the backup line. It's urgent and it's safe." He put the phone away, walked back to his bike. The cruiser was still across from Carla's. Same patient engine, same watching stillness. Mason got on the bike and rode north, keeping to surface streets, giving whoever was watching a clean and uninteresting picture of a man going nowhere in particular, while in the back of his mind the thing he'd just learned moved through him in slow, heavy waves. Karen had found this. 3 years ago she'd found it, and someone had shut her down and shipped her to Alaska, and the infrastructure had continued. And now Emma Collins had stumbled out of that same infrastructure on a desert night and ended up in Mason's arms. And the geometry of it, the specific, terrible geometry of it, was not coincidence. It was the natural result of something left running that should have been stopped 3 years ago. He thought about what he'd said to Rourke in the shop this morning, that he was protecting the child. He'd meant it. He still meant it. But the scope of what needed to be done to actually protect her had just multiplied by a factor he hadn't calculated for. The shop was full when he arrived, more members than the morning, word having moved through the Iron Hollow riders in the quiet way it moved when something serious was operating, not through announcement, but through the specific gravitational pull of men who have been through enough to recognize when weight is accumulating. Briggs was still at the Canyon property with Clara and Emma. Everyone else was here. Rourke had Garrett's information. Mason saw it in his face when he walked in. The particular set of it, jaw forward, eyes level and very still, the expression of a man who has processed bad news and come out the other side of it into decision. "You knew?" Rourke said. "About Karen? Garrett told me in the alley." Mason came to the center of the floor, didn't sit. "I didn't know she'd been on this case. We don't—" He stopped, chose a different path through it. "We've been rebuilding our relationship. She doesn't share work with me. I don't push." "But she's connected to the man behind the property," Rourke said. "She tried to bring him down 3 years ago. Someone stopped her. Someone inside federal structures. That's the implication." The room absorbed this. 14 men in various states of standing and sitting, in the garage that smelled like oil and metal and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke from years of evenings, with the afternoon light coming gray and flat through the high windows, and a wind picking up outside that moved the sign above the bay door on its chain. A man named Holt, who had been mostly quiet, spoke from near the far wall. He was 60, the oldest member, a Vietnam-era veteran who had been Mason's father's friend before he'd been Mason's, and when he spoke, people listened not because of his size. He was compact, almost slight, but because of the quality of his attention to things. "So we have a local operation," Holt said, "with law enforcement assets connected to a network that has survived a federal investigation, with the federal agent who ran the investigation currently isolated in Alaska." He paused. "And we have one witness, a child, who does not officially exist in any system we can find." "Yes," Mason said. "What is the child's actual origin?" Holt asked. "Your read." "I think she was moved through the placement network. I think something went wrong on the night she ended up at the diner. Either she escaped or she was lost in transit, or whatever was supposed to happen to her at that location didn't happen because she ran. I think the people running the operation believe she may be able to identify individuals involved, which is why they're watching rather than reporting her missing." He looked at Holt. "She's not their lost property, she's their exposure." Holt nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had already been thinking in this direction and was now confirmed. "Then protecting her," Holt said, "requires dismantling the thing that hunts her. Otherwise, you've moved the problem, not solved it." "Yeah." "Which is not something this club does with local law enforcement on the other side of it," Garrett said from the corner. His voice was careful, not resistant, precise. We've operated in gray areas, Mason. We've done things outside official channels, but we've never gone directly against active law enforcement assets. The cost of that, I know the cost, Mason said. Do you? Garrett's eyes were steady. Because if Pruitt is connected to Cell, and Cell has federal reach, the exposure for this club goes beyond a legal problem. It's existential. They will dismantle everything we've built, the veterans programs, the shelter work, the community access we've spent 15 years establishing, all of it, gone. He paused. And I'm not saying we don't do it. I'm saying we need to know what we're committing to. The room was very quiet. Mason looked at Garrett, and what he saw in the man's face was not cowardice. Garrett Cole had no mechanism for cowardice. It simply wasn't in the architecture, but something harder and more specific. The thing that comes from caring about what you've built, from the knowledge that it matters beyond the people in this room. Everything you just described, Mason said, is also true for Emma Collins, except she doesn't have any of it to lose because she never had any of it to begin with. He paused. And Marcus Webb is missing, and Karen spent 3 years building a case that someone used institutional power to destroy. He looked around the room. The system that was supposed to protect all of them failed. That's what we're looking at. That's the actual situation. Nobody spoke. I'm not asking anyone to go to war, Mason said. I'm asking us to do what we've always done, which is be the thing that shows up when the system doesn't, quietly, carefully, without giving them anything to use against us. He looked at Rourke. We protect Emma. We find Marcus. We get the information to someone who can move it through a channel that hasn't been compromised, and we make it impossible for Cell and Pruitt to bury this. Rourke had been watching him the whole time. He looked at Holt now. Holt gave the smallest inclination of his head, a gesture Mason had seen before, years ago, in rooms where the direction of something changed. All right, Rourke said. We're in. All the way in. The room moved. Not dramatically. Just the particular shift in posture and intention that happens when a group of men who know how to function under pressure align on a decision. Quiet, collective, absolute. And then Mason's backup phone rang. He looked at the screen. Alaska area code. He stepped to the bay door and answered it. Karen! The voice on the other end was his daughter's, familiar and guarded and controlled in a way that had always told him how much of her was her mother's and how much was his. The control specifically his, the caution inherited and refined. Dad? A pause. You said Victor Cell. Yeah. How do you know that name? I found a child, Karen, behind the Dusty Mile Diner 2 nights ago. A 6-year-old girl, no legal identity I can trace, adaptation behaviors consistent with chronic trauma, and the property connects to a holding company that connects to Cell. He paused. And then I found out you spent 14 months building a case on him and someone pulled you off it. The silence on the line was the particular silence of someone choosing which version of a conversation to have. It's not safe to discuss on any line, she said finally. Then unsafe it. Because there are 2 vehicles sitting surveillance on people I love in Copper Mesa right now, and a teenager who saw the wrong location is missing, and the man whose operation I think this child witnessed is on the Economic Development Advisory Board and having steak dinners with local law enforcement. He heard his voice doing something, not anger, something below anger, something more fundamental. You found this 3 years ago, and they buried you, Karen. So I need you to tell me what you know. Another silence. Longer. When she spoke again, something had shifted in her voice. The control still there, but something coming through it. Something that cost her. The placement company is called Bright Futures Transitional Care, she said. 5 states, now 6. They hold legitimate licenses in every state they operate in. The private side, the real operation, runs through a contractor network that interfaces with the placement side at the point of transport. Children who enter the system through legitimate channels occasionally don't arrive at their licensed placements. The paperwork shows they did. The children don't. Mason stood in the bay door with the cold air coming in off the street and listened to his daughter's voice describe the infrastructure he'd been circling for 2 days, and the scale of it moved through him like weather. How many? He said. Over the 14 months I tracked the case, confirmed discrepancies in 41 placements across 3 states. A pause. That's confirmed, Dad. Conservative count. 41. The federal contact who compromised your investigation, Mason said. Do you know who it was? I have a strong belief, not proof. Her voice tightened. The case was closed before I could build proof. That's why I was transferred. They couldn't fire me without creating a record, so they moved me to where I couldn't continue working on it. Give me what you have, Mason said. Everything. Whatever you built before they closed you down. I can't transmit it through any channel they could be monitoring. Then get on a plane, Mason said. Come here, bring it in person. A long silence. The longest since the call began. He could hear her breathing. The same rhythm he'd heard when she was a child and was deciding something. The slight irregularity that meant the decision was real, and the cost of it was also real. There's something else, she said. About the child. Mason went very still. Tell me. If she came through Bright Future's system, there will be a file. Encoded, but there. I know the coding structure from the investigation. If I can access it. She stopped. Started again. There was a child flagged in my investigation 3 years ago. A girl, approximately 3 years old at the time, who appeared in a transport manifest and then disappeared from the legitimate placement record. The file name was a number, but there was a handwritten annotation in the copy I obtained. She paused. The annotation said rabbit. The bay door wind came through and moved the hem of Mason's jacket and went past him into the shop and the warmth of the room behind him, and Mason Creed stood at the threshold between inside and outside with his phone against his ear and understood, completely, suddenly, with the terrible clarity of a thing that had been true before you knew it, that Emma Collins had not accidentally stumbled into his path on a cold desert night. She had been in this system for 3 years. She had been in it since she was 3 years old, and his daughter had found her file 3 years ago and had been shut down before she could follow it anywhere. She has a stuffed rabbit, Mason said. His voice came out almost steady. She calls him Professor Hops. She won't let go of him. The silence on Karen's end lasted exactly long enough for him to understand that she was not surprised by this, that somewhere in the last 3 years she had carried the image of a number in a transport manifest and a handwritten annotation and had not let go of it either, the way Emma had not let go of the rabbit, the way people hold the one thing left that connects them to something they refuse to stop believing in. I'll be there in 6 hours, Karen said. Don't let anyone near her until I get there. She ended the call. Mason stood in the bay door and did not move for a duration that he would not have been able to measure. The wind came in. The shop hummed behind him with the quiet machinery of men preparing to do something that would cost them. Outside, Copper Mesa went about its Tuesday afternoon with no idea what was sitting inside the Iron Hollow Rider's garage on the east side of town. He turned around. Rourke was looking at him. Everyone was looking at him. They'd heard enough from his end to know the tenor of it, and they were waiting with the patience of men who have learned that some information needs to be delivered standing up. My daughter is the federal agent who ran the original investigation, Mason said. She found Emma's file 3 years ago. The child has been in the system since she was 3. He paused. Karen is coming here. 6 hours. Nobody moved. Then Holt, from the far wall, in the quiet voice that carried the way quiet voices do when the room is perfectly still. The child came to you for a reason. Mason looked at him. I don't mean by accident, Holt said. I mean that sometimes the shape of things has a logic we don't see until we're already inside it. He paused. Your daughter found her 3 years ago and couldn't reach her. You found her 2 nights ago in the dark. He looked at Mason with eyes that were very old and very clear. The child was always going to end up somewhere that connected back to you, because the people who were supposed to protect her kept failing, and the thing that doesn't fail is what you built. He meant the club. He meant the work. He meant the 15 years of showing up in the gaps where the systems didn't reach. Now you finish what your daughter started. Mason stood with that, the weight of it, the particular and unreasonable and somehow load-bearing weight of a thing that turned out to be yours to carry not by choice, but by the specific gravity of who you were and what you'd built and who your people were. His phone buzzed. Garrett. He looked at the screen. A text, 2 sentences. Pruitt just cleared his watch rotation early. His personal vehicle left the department lot 10 minutes ago, heading east. East. The direction of the Canyon Road. The direction of Santos's old property. Mason looked at Rourke and said, "They found the Canyon Road." The shop moved in the next 4 seconds with the efficiency of men who have trained themselves out of the pause between understanding and action. Rourke was already at the pegboard pulling keys. Garrett was on his phone calling Briggs. Holt had his jacket on before Mason had finished the sentence, and the 2 younger members by the far bay were moving toward their bikes with the focused, unhurried speed of people who know that rushing produces errors, and errors in this kind of situation produce consequences that don't undo. Mason was already at his bike. He had the engine running before the bay door finished opening, and the cold hit him like a wall, and he went through it and turned east on the street outside the shop and opened the throttle with the particular controlled aggression of a man who is moving fast because the situation requires it, and not 1 increment faster, because 1 increment faster in the dark on canyon roads is where people die. His phone was in his jacket pocket buzzing. He couldn't answer it. He rode. Behind him, he could hear the other engines coming out of the shop. Rourke's Road King, Garrett's Sportster, Holt's old Electroglide that sounded like a slow river and moved like something that had decided where it was going a long time ago. The sound of them together in the cold night air was a specific thing, layered and complex. And if you were the kind of person who understood what that sound meant, not the sound itself, but the intention behind it, the weight of men moving together toward something that mattered, it was not a comfortable sound to have coming toward you. Mason took the Canyon Road turnoff at speed and felt the rear wheel track slightly in the gravel at the edge of the asphalt and corrected without thinking, the correction automatic, 15 years of these roads in his hands. The Canyon Road ran 8 miles to Santos's property. 8 miles of 2-lane blacktop dropping into the wash country east of town. No lights, no guardrails on the worst sections, the kind of road that filtered for the committed. His headlight cut the dark ahead, and the dark gave him the road back in increments, and he watched the increments come and watched the road surface and watched for lights. And at the 4-mile mark he saw them. 2 sets of headlights, stationary, 1 high and 1 low, which meant 1 vehicle on the road and 1 on the property itself. And his stomach did the specific thing it did when a tactical situation confirmed its worst geometry. Pruitt had gotten there first. He killed his headlight. Rode the last 4 miles on the ambient light of the desert sky. Stars and a partial moon, enough to see the road if you knew it, and Mason Creed knew this road. He heard the other bikes behind him go dark too, one by one, without any signal exchanged, because this was the kind of thing they understood without being told. He stopped a 1/4 mile from the property gate and put the bike on its stand and moved on foot into the scrub beside the road. And Rourke was beside him 30 seconds later, and then Garrett, and then Holt, moving with the terrible quiet of a man who had been moving through the dark after things for 60 years, and had the economy of motion that kind of experience produces. From here they could see the property clearly. The old Santos house, a single-story adobe, a workshop building behind it, a small corral that hadn't held animals in years. 1 vehicle on the road at the gate, an unmarked sedan, dark, engine off, 1 occupant visible as a silhouette behind the wheel. 1 vehicle on the property itself, inside the gate, headlights on and illuminating the front of the house. A black SUV, large, engine running. 2 men were visible outside the SUV, standing, not moving, the posture of men who are waiting for someone inside to complete something. "Briggs is in there," Garrett said, very low. "Clara and Emma," Mason said. "And Denny." "Denny's armed," Rourke said. "So are they," Mason said. "And they have the legal authority, and we don't." He looked at the gate, at the sedan, at the 2 men by the SUV. "Pruitt came personally. That tells us something." "Tells us he's scared," Holt said. "Tells us he can't delegate this," Mason said. "If he could trust anyone else with it, he'd have sent deputies in marked cruisers with a legal pretext. He's here in personal vehicles with people I don't recognize, which means he's operating outside his official capacity." He paused. "Which means whatever happens here tonight, he cannot file a report about it." Rourke looked at him. "That cuts both ways." "Yeah," Mason said. "It does." He thought about Emma asleep inside that house, He thought about Clara, who had spent her whole career taking care of frightened children, and who would be, right now, positioned between Emma and whatever was at the door with the particular calm ferocity of a woman who has spent 31 years being the last line between a sick child and the thing that scared them. He thought about Briggs, compressed and ready, doing the soldier's calculation, counting threats, assessing angles, holding. He thought about the rabbit standing on a table and a child who had not let go of it in 3 years. "The man in the sedan at the gate is alone," Mason said. "Garrett." "Yeah." "You know what I need." Garrett was already moving, low and quiet, angling through the scrub toward the road below the sedan's sightline. He moved the way people move who have been through things, without wasted motion, without hesitation, the body's intelligence running the operation while the mind stayed available for the variables. "The two at the SUV," Mason said to Rourke and Holt. "If Pruitt is inside, then we pull him out," Rourke said. "We don't touch the men outside unless they move on the house. Clear?" "Clear," Holt said. "I go through the gate," Mason said. "Alone. Visible. I give Pruitt someone to focus on." He paused. "You two come in behind while he's focused." "Mason?" "I know." He looked at Rourke. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" He didn't answer that, because the honest answer was that he knew what needed to happen and had no certainty about the cost of it, and those were two different things, and he'd stopped pretending they were the same a long time ago. He stood up from the scrub and walked to the gate. He walked with his hands visible at his sides, moving at a steady pace, not slow enough to look like caution, and not fast enough to look like threat. The precise, calibrated pace of a man who has decided the most dangerous thing he can do is be completely readable. The two men by the SUV saw him at 40 yards. Both moved, the instinctive shift of bodies toward a perceived approach, and he watched them assess him and saw the moment they registered what he was. Big man, leather cut, no visible weapon, moving toward them like he owned the property. "Private land," said the closer one. He was broad, mid-40s, wearing a jacket that wasn't a uniform but wasn't civilian either. His hand was near his hip. "I know," Mason said. He stopped 10 feet away. "My club's name is on the title." He looked at the man steadily. "So actually you're the ones on private land." The man processed this, looked at his partner. Something uncertain moved between them. "Sergeant Pruitt, inside?" Mason said. Neither of them answered. "He came to find a child," Mason said. "I'd like to talk to him about that." He kept his voice level, almost conversational. "You two can stay out here. I'll go in." "You're not going anywhere," the closer man said. "Okay," Mason said, and stood there. Because the objective was to hold their attention, and he was holding it. And somewhere in the dark to his left, Rourke and Holt were moving along the property fence line toward the far side of the house. And somewhere on the road below the gate, Garrett was having a different and quieter conversation with the man in the sedan. The front door of the house opened. Pruitt came out onto the small porch with the light behind him, and Mason saw him clearly for the first time. A man in his 50s, trim, with the kind of face that had been built for projecting authority and had spent enough years doing it that the projection had become the face. Silver at the temples. Pressed civilian clothes. The particular stillness of a man who is accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He looked at Mason and didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting this specific variable and had prepared for it. "Mr. Creed," Pruitt said. "Sergeant." "You've been busy." "I found a child in the cold," Mason said. "I brought her somewhere safe. Seems like a simple story." "It would be," Pruitt said, "if it ended there." He came down the 2 porch steps and stood in the headlights of the SUV with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Mason with the patient, measuring expression of a man doing arithmetic. "But you've been making calls, asking questions, involving people." He paused. "Involving your club." "The child needed protecting." "The child needed processing," Pruitt said, "through the appropriate channels." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had said this kind of thing before and had found it sufficient. "She's part of an active welfare case, a legitimate one. There are proper procedures." "The proper procedures," Mason said, left her alone in the desert in the dark at 11 degrees. Something moved in Pruitt's face. Not guilt. Something colder than guilt. The expression of a man recalculating the required force of an argument. "You don't understand the full scope of the situation," he said. "I'm starting to," Mason said. A beat. "Victor Sell," Mason said. "Meridian Property Group, Bright Futures Transitional Care. A federal investigation that closed 14 months in with no charges because the lead agent was transferred to Alaska." He watched Pruitt's face during this list and watched the arithmetic change behind the man's eyes. "I understand more scope than you were counting on." The porch light was behind Pruitt and the SUV headlights were between them, and the desert was dark in every direction and perfectly quiet except for the engine and the faint movement of cold air through the scrub. The two men by the SUV had gone very still. Pruitt took his right hand out of his pocket. Mason tracked the hand. Empty. But the gesture itself, the deliberate display of the empty hand, was a communication. It said, "I am making a decision about how hard this has to get." "You're one person," Pruitt said, "with a club behind you and a federal agent daughter who has already been neutralized and a missing teenager that nobody is going to find in a way that creates problems for anyone." He said it without heat, the way men state facts. "And I have resources you cannot match, in positions you cannot reach, with paperwork that will support whatever version of tonight needs to be supported." He paused. "The girl comes with me. You walk away. Your sister, your club, your daughter. They all go home without consequences." He looked at Mason with something that might have been in another version of this man, something like professional respect. "That's the deal. It's the only deal." Mason looked at him. He thought about 41 confirmed discrepancies. He thought about a child who had been in a system since age 3 and had arrived at his hands at age 6 carrying nothing but a rabbit and the last possible version of trust. He thought about Karen in Alaska, files on her laptop, 14 months of evidence sitting in cold storage while the thing she'd tried to stop kept running. He thought about what Holt had said. "Now you finish what your daughter started." "No," Mason said. Pruitt's face changed. The arithmetic completed itself, and the result was not what he'd preferred, but he'd prepared for it. He raised his chin slightly and looked past Mason toward the gate, and Mason knew without turning that the man from the sedan had been brought forward, or had not been brought forward, which would tell him something about how Garrett's conversation had gone. He didn't turn to check. He kept his eyes on Pruitt. "Garrett," he said, at a volume calibrated for the darkness. From somewhere behind and to his right. "Here." So the sedan was handled, one variable removed. The two men by the SUV exchanged a look. The closer one started to move, and Mason said, without raising his voice, without moving his body, "I wouldn't." And something in the register of it, not the volume, but the frequency, the specific, exhausted, absolute quality of a man who has already decided how far he's willing to go and is no longer in negotiation with himself about it, stopped the man where he was. The front door of the house opened again. Briggs came out. He was a head taller than Pruitt and stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms at his sides and looked at the assembled situation in the headlights with the expression of a man who had done multiple tours and found this level of tension entirely manageable. Behind him, in the doorway, Clara appeared. She looked at Pruitt, then at Mason, then back at Pruitt, and the look she gave him was the most specific and devastating thing Mason had seen in recent memory. The look of a woman who has spent 31 years preventing harm to children and is looking at someone who causes it, and has no language for him because language implies a shared category of human behavior, and she is no longer willing to grant him that. "She's not going anywhere with you," Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. "Not tonight, not ever, not through any procedure you can produce." "Ma'am, don't," Clara said. Pruitt looked at her, at Briggs, at Mason. The calculation running, variables updating. He was smart enough to understand the arithmetic had changed. One man at the sedan neutralized. 3 more bikers unaccounted for. He didn't know about Rourke and Holt yet, which meant they were still his blind spot. The club's name on the property title creating legal complications for whatever version of tonight he'd planned to file paperwork about. The two men by the SUV were looking at their employer for instruction and not getting it. Then from the far side of the house, from the dark where the fence line ran, a sound that Mason knew and that Pruitt didn't recognize immediately, a boot on gravel, then another, and then Rourke Gallagher walked into the edge of the SUV's headlights from the left side and Holt walked in from the right, and they stood there with their arms loose at their sides in the specific posture of men who have arrived somewhere they intended to arrive, and the tableau was complete. Pruitt looked at Rourke, at Holt, back at Mason. "You brought your whole club," he said. "I brought some of them," Mason said. The implication settled. Pruitt didn't know how many. He was doing the count and coming up short on his side. The two men by the SUV were now doing the count too, and they were arriving at an answer they liked less than the one they'd come here with. "This doesn't end here," Pruitt said. His voice had changed, the authority voice, the procedural certainty. It was still in there, but it was load-bearing something that had started to crack underneath it. "Whatever you think you've accomplished tonight, I think I've accomplished not letting you take a 6-year-old child," Mason said. "That's all I'm trying to accomplish right now. Victor Sell has resources. My daughter has 14 months of federal casework and she's landing in 6 hours, Mason said. And whatever Sell's resources are, they need the operation to stay quiet to survive. We've already made that impossible." He looked at Pruitt steadily. "You know how investigations work, Sergeant. You know that the moment the first piece of information gets to the right channel, the quiet goes away. We've already made that first contact." It was a calculated disclosure, true, but designed to accelerate Pruitt's calculation toward the decision Mason needed him to make. "Tonight is already over. The question is what you want the rest of it to look like." Pruitt stood in the headlights, and the cold came down off the canyon walls and moved through everyone present with total impartiality, and the engine of the SUV ran with the low, steady sound of a machine indifferent to what was happening around it. Mason watched the decision happen in real time. It was not fast. It was the decision of a man who has built something over years and is in the moment of understanding that what he built will not survive what is coming, and is trying to calculate whether there is still a version of this in which he personally survives it, and is finding the calculation increasingly difficult. One of the men by the SUV spoke quietly to the other. Mason caught 2 words. "Call him." The other man shook his head. Another data point. Even salespeople weren't certain enough to escalate to their principal, which meant they were operating with limited authorization and had hit its edge. Then Pruitt said, "Step aside." He meant the driveway. He meant the SUV. He meant he was leaving. Mason stepped aside. He didn't do it because he was conceding. He did it because Pruitt leaving was better than Pruitt staying, because the night had been won on the ground that mattered. Emma was in the house, Clara was in the doorway, the club was on the property, and the federal clock had started. And because a man who has decided he's leaving will do so with less damage than a man who feels cornered. Pruitt walked to the SUV. The 2 men followed. They got in. The vehicle reversed toward the gate without hurrying, performed the specific careful turn of a large vehicle in a confined space, and went out through the gate and down the road without looking back. Mason stood in the empty space where the headlights had been and listened to the engine fade down the canyon road and disappear into the general silence of the desert night. Garrett came up beside him. "Sedan driver's in the scrub, zip-tied to a mesquite, non-violent. He'll be uncomfortable for a while." He paused. He said 3 words when I approached him. "I'm done talking." So I let him not talk. "Call it into the department anonymously in an hour," Mason said. "Enough time to matter, not enough to be a problem." "Done." Rourke came up on the other side. He looked at the gate where the SUV had gone. His jaw was doing the thing. "He'll regroup," he said. "Yeah. Sell will regroup." "Yeah." 6 hours, Rourke said. "Not a complaint. A timeline." 6 hours, Mason confirmed. He turned and went up the porch steps. Briggs moved aside. Clara was still in the doorway, and she looked at him when he came up, and her face went through several things in rapid succession that she didn't try to control and that he didn't try to minimize. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his and gripped it for one moment tight and then let go, the way strong people exchange the weight of things between them when words aren't adequate. He went inside. The house was small and warm and smelled like the coffee Denny had apparently made at some point. And in the room off the hallway, Emma Collins was asleep in the bed, the blankets pulled to her chin, the rabbit tucked in beside her with his worn ears level with the pillow, standing watch in the way stuffed animals do when children have appointed them to that purpose, and they have accepted it. Mason stood in the doorway of the room and looked at her sleeping. 6 years old. 3 years in a system that had been designed to look like protection and function as its opposite. A night in the desert. And now here, in the improbable safety of a house at the end of a canyon road, breathing with the complete unguarded steadiness of a child who has finally, provisionally, against all the evidence that had been presented to her about the world, allowed herself to sleep. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to the main room and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, because the couch had Denny on it already, and the chair had Holt, and the floor was fine. The floor had always been fine, and he put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. His phone said 4 hours and 12 minutes until Karen's flight landed. He thought about Pruitt driving back to town, about Sel, wherever he was, receiving a call in the next hour that would tell him tonight had not gone according to plan. About the machinery of what was coming, Karen's files, the evidence chain, the contacts she'd said were still reliable, the state investigators Clara had mentioned with her hospital connections, the long and specific work of dismantling something that had been built to survive exposure. He thought about what Pruitt had said, resources you cannot match, in positions you cannot reach. He thought about the Iron Hollow riders outside in the cold, Rourke at the gate, Holt sitting against the fence post with the patience of a very old and very decided man, Garrett on his phone, methodical, building the next layer of the thing, Briggs in the kitchen doorway, upright, attentive, the door covered. He thought about what Pruitt had not understood, which was the nature of the resource he was looking at. Not numbers, not weapons, not legal authority or institutional reach. The thing Pruitt couldn't calculate because he'd spent his career in systems that ran on those currencies and couldn't account for the other one, the currency of men who have already lost the things that were supposed to make them afraid to lose anything. Men who have been through the worst and come out the other side and built something in the wreckage, not because the system supported it, but despite the system, out of the specific stubborn human refusal to let the worst thing be the last thing. That was the resource. And it was not finite. His phone buzzed. Karen, wheels up. See you in 4 hours. I have everything. He put the phone away. Outside, the desert night was doing what it always did, which was to be immense and cold and entirely indifferent. And somewhere out on the canyon road, the sound of Harley engines moved in the dark as Rourke's outer perimeter made its quiet circuit, and the sound came through the walls of the house like a frequency below hearing, something you felt in your chest rather than your ears. And Mason Creed sat on the floor of a small adobe house in the canyon country east of Copper Mesa, with his head against the wall and his eyes closed, and the specific terrible load-bearing weight of everything that was coming pressing down on him from every direction, and held it, because that was what you did. Because there was no one else to hold it right now, and because in the other room a child was sleeping with a rabbit tucked beside her. And that was the only reason any of this had ever mattered, and the only reason any of it would ever need to be. He was still on the floor when the headlights came up the canyon road 4 hours and 17 minutes later. He heard the engine before he saw the lights. A rental car sound, small and economical, nothing like the Harleys. And he was at the door before it stopped, and Karen Creed stepped out into the cold pre-dawn dark and looked at her father across the roof of the car, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment was doing too much work for words to fit inside it. She was 32 now. She had his jaw and her mother's eyes, and the particular posture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that the carry had become part of the structure. She had a laptop bag over one shoulder and a hard-sided case in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been on a plane for 4 hours running through scenarios and had landed inside the one she'd most hoped for and most feared simultaneously. "She's inside," Mason said. Karen exhaled. One breath. Long. Then she came around the car and walked up the steps, and he held the door and she went in. She stood in the doorway of the room where Emma slept for a very long time. Mason stood behind her and didn't speak. He watched his daughter look at the child in the bed, watched something move through Karen's face that had no clean name. Relief and grief and fury, and something that was close to the specific pain of a thing you tried to stop and couldn't and found still breathing anyway, 3 years later, improbably, against the math of everything that had been working against her. Karen set the hard case on the floor quietly, put her hand briefly against the doorframe, then turned and came back to the main room. "The rabbit," she said. Her voice was controlled. Barely. "Professor Hobbs," Mason said. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. The annotation in the case file. It was her nickname in the intake documentation, before they removed her name from the record. She looked at him. They called her Rabbit, because she wouldn't let go of it. She paused. "I spent 6 months trying to find out who she was and where she'd gone, and every record had been sanitized. She was a number in a transport log and a handwritten word on a copy I wasn't supposed to have." "She's Emma Collins," Mason said. "That's the name she gave me. It may not be her legal name." "It's the name she chose," Karen said. "That's enough for now." They sat at the kitchen table and Karen opened the laptop in the hard case, a portable drive, encrypted, 14 months of a federal agent's obsessive, methodical, ultimately suppressed work. And Mason called Rourke in from the gate and Garrett from the perimeter, and in the thin hours before dawn in a small adobe house in Canyon Country, they built the package. Karen had names, not just cell, not just the placement network, the person inside the federal structure who had received case updates and passed them to Cell's legal team. A deputy director 3 layers above Karen's direct chain, a man with 30 years of service, and a retirement account that had been growing at a rate inconsistent with his salary for the last 8 years. She had financial records she'd obtained legally and preserved on the drive. She had transport manifests cross-referenced with placement records across 6 states, showing the discrepancy pattern for 31 of the 41 confirmed cases. She had emails, not obtained from the compromised federal channel, but from a private server Cell had used for his advisory board communications, accessed through a contact Karen declined to name, who had sent her a file 18 months ago that she'd been sitting on in Alaska waiting for the right moment. The right moment had found her. They sent the package at 4:47 in the morning to 3 destinations simultaneously: a federal inspector general's office in a different district from the one that had closed Karen's original case, a state attorney general's office that had jurisdiction over 2 of the states in the placement network, and a journalist Karen trusted, not for publication yet, but as insurance, as the thing that ensured the package couldn't be quietly buried the way Karen's investigation had been buried. 3 channels, 3 different institutional structures, too many to close simultaneously. When it was sent, Karen sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her father. He was looking at the table, at the empty coffee cups, at the grain of the wood that had probably been there since Santos had bought the place 20 years ago. "I should have called you," Karen said. 3 years ago, when they shut me down. You didn't know I was connected to any of it." "I know." She paused. "But I should have called anyway." He looked up, his daughter's face in the kitchen light, tired and precise and more open than he'd seen it in years, maybe ever. The control still there, but something behind it that had been allowed to show. "I wasn't always easy to call," he said. "No," she said, "but I could have tried harder." A silence that was not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who have the same flaw. The refusal to ask for what they need, recognizing it in each other from the other side of a situation that has cost them both something. "You're here now," Mason said. "Yeah," Karen said. "I'm here now." Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe, looked at both of them, and without a word went to the coffee maker and started a fresh pot, because Clara Bennett had navigated the emotional geometry of impossible situations for 31 years, and understood that some conversations needed to be witnessed quietly and some needed coffee, and this one needed both. Pruitt was arrested at his home at 6:15 in the morning by state investigators who had been routed the package at 4:47 and had moved with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. His two deputies who had been working the Route 9 sector were arrested at the department an hour later. Victor Sell was taken into custody in Phoenix by federal agents operating out of the district Karen had specified, the one unconnected to the compromised deputy director, before noon. The deputy director resigned before charges were filed. His resignation was accepted and then superseded by an indictment the following week. Marcus Webb was found 4 days later. He was alive. He was in poor condition and he would carry things from those 4 days for the rest of his life. But he was alive. And his mother, who had spent those 4 days in a state that defied description, was the one who told him he was safe, sitting beside his hospital bed in the specific posture of a woman who had bargained with every version of hope she possessed and had been allowed to keep it. Mason heard about Marcus from Garrett, who heard it from a deputy he trusted, and he sat with it in the shop for a while before he told anyone else, sitting with the specific weight of it, the relief and the cost existing simultaneously, the way they always do when the outcome is the best available one and not the clean one. Emma's legal identity took time. It took several months of work by child advocates and attorneys and a federal process that moved at the speed federal processes move, which is not fast. What they established was that Emma had been removed from a situation of parental incapacity at age 2, had entered the legitimate placement system at 3, and had been diverted into the shadow network within 6 months of entry. The family she'd been assigned to, on paper, had never seen her. The placement that had generated her original nickname had been the last legitimate record. Everything after was transit documentation and a handwritten word on a copy of a file. She had been a number for 3 years. She became Emma Collins legally 4 months after Mason found her behind the Dusty Mile. Collins because she'd chosen it, because it was hers and she'd given it to herself in the dark, and it had gotten her to a man who went down on one knee in the frozen gravel and didn't leave, and she intended to keep it. The workshop went up in the spring. Mason's garage on the east side of Copper Mesa, the one he'd been running unofficially for years, fixing veterans' bikes and charging nothing and not talking about it, was extended into the adjacent lot that Rourke had quietly arranged through the club's property connection, and by May it had 2 additional bays and a side room with tools and a bench at kid height and a wall where photographs would eventually go, though it started empty. Clara's support center opened in the building next door 6 weeks later. She'd been talking about it for 3 years and had never had the particular combination of funding and fury and community goodwill to make it real, and the events of the winter had produced all 3 simultaneously in a way that she'd noted was terrible and necessary, the way certain things are. On the day they opened both buildings, it was warm enough that people stood outside in the courtyard between them, and there were folding tables with food that various people had brought, and there were children from the neighborhood who had been informed that there would be cake and had acted accordingly, and there were veterans who had heard about the workshop and come quietly and stood near the walls, the way people do when they're not sure yet whether they're allowed to need something. Emma was there in yellow rain boots because she'd insisted on them despite the absence of rain, and she was carrying Professor Hops in the crook of her arm, though the grip was looser now, the rabbit no longer pressed flat against her face, but simply present, resting in the crook of her arm with the comfortable ease of something that didn't need to be protected quite so desperately anymore. She planted flowers with Clara in the strip of soil along the courtyard wall. Marigolds, because Clara said they were hard to kill, and Emma had said that was the right kind of flower for a place like this, and Clara had looked at her with an expression she didn't try to control. Karen stayed for the opening. She was based in Phoenix now, reassigned to a field office there after the investigation broke, a reassignment that was, this time, a genuine one. And she drove down for the weekend and stood in the courtyard drinking coffee from a paper cup and watching her father move through the crowd in the way he moved, which was to say quietly and on the periphery, making sure things were working without requiring acknowledgement that he'd had anything to do with it. She went and stood beside him. He handed her a second cup of coffee without looking, as if he'd known she was coming, which he had, because he'd been watching her from across the courtyard for 20 minutes. "Good day," she said. "Yeah." They stood for a while in the comfortable quiet of two people who had found their way back to each other through something terrible and were not taking the current non-terrible moment for granted. "She asked me yesterday," Karen said, "whether you were going to stay." Mason looked across the courtyard to where Emma was pressing a marigold into the soil with the focused seriousness she brought to everything that mattered to her. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to ask you." He was quiet for a moment. "She hasn't asked." "She will," Karen said. "She's just deciding whether she trusts the answer enough to want it." He understood that. He understood it with the specific comprehension of a man who had spent most of his adult life deciding whether things were safe enough to want. He looked at his daughter beside him, and at the courtyard full of people, and at Emma in her yellow rain boots pressing flowers into the earth, and he felt the particular, unfamiliar, slightly terrifying quality of a life that had stopped moving away from things and started moving toward them. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the folding tables were being collapsed, and the veterans had mostly drifted toward the workshop where Rourke was showing someone the difference between two types of carburetor with the genuine evangelical enthusiasm he reserved for mechanical things, Emma found Mason sitting on the courtyard wall with his coffee and climbed up beside him without asking permission, which she never asked anymore. She sat there for a while. Professor Hopp sat between them. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. She was looking at the marigolds. "In Copper Mesa?" "Yeah." He looked at the flowers she'd planted, at the buildings, at the sign Clara had put above the center's door, simple black letters on white, for the ones who needed a place. He thought about the road, which had been his answer to everything for 10 years, the moving, the passing through, the deliberate refusal to be anywhere long enough to be needed. He thought about what it had cost, what it had protected him from, and what it had prevented. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to stay." Emma nodded. Once, with the same quality of recording something important that she'd had the first night, when he'd told her she didn't have to leave. She picked up the rabbit and held him in her lap, not clutched, just held, the way you hold something that belongs to you and has always been yours and doesn't need to be defended anymore. "Good," she said. Across the courtyard, the last of the afternoon light was doing something warm and specific to the adobe walls, and from somewhere around the front of the building came the sound of Harley engines. 2, then 3, then more. The Iron Hollow riders heading out into the early evening in the loose, unhurried formation they used when there was nowhere to be but somewhere to go. And the sound rolled through the courtyard and over the wall and out into the desert, and faded the way good things fade, gradually, leaving the quality of itself behind in the air, long after the sound itself was gone. Mason sat on the courtyard wall with a 6-year-old girl and a stuffed rabbit and a cup of cooling coffee and listened to the engines go. He didn't move. He had nowhere else to be. For the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, that was not a loss. It was the whole point. End.